Good morning, my friends. Today it's another gray day. Looks a little bit warmer than yesterday. Can't really tell. Still snow on the ground, so nothing's really changed since yesterday. It got a little bit colder later in the night. I noticed. I don't know if that changed this morning, but we will see when I go outside today. So as you know, it's Friday, so I have a book review today, and today I'm reviewing Conversations with Scorsese, or Scorsese, if we want to pronounce his name properly. Um, if some of you might know, Martin Scorsese is one of my favorite filmmakers of all time. He's definitely someone who I've definitely watched like most of his films very intensely. Uh, he's definitely one of my biggest inspirations when I was interested in film, and I still am interested in film, just not in the same degree as I was maybe when I was 16, 17. I still want to go into filmmaking at some point in the future, but he's definitely one of my biggest influences. And I think one of the things that I've related to him the most is his use of music in his films as a means of sort of like encapsulating sort of an environment, right? He was sort of the one who sort of started that concept of using pop music to illustrate various scenes in his movies instead of just relying on a score. I think the only movie that he used an actual score was Taxi Driver, which was more suitable, I guess, to that narrative. But you watch like Goodfellas, all like the most iconic scenes always have like this sort of 60s bubblegum pop sort of music playing in the background, and he was the one who sort of started that. A lot of people attribute that to like Quentin Tarantino, but Quentin Tarantino, he came afterwards, obviously, and he did his way of doing it with a very it was almost like a music video style in which he sort of used music. It was similar, but not in the same vein. The way Martin Scorsese uses his music is sort of like it's painting the environment, right, and the picture of the environment that these characters might live in. And I think it's way more in depth than other filmmakers who try to do the same thing. And even myself, when I was 16, 17, I tried to do the same thing, but I didn't really get the concept of using this kind of music or kind of pop music inside of films. So overall, this book basically takes us through his entire life with this guy Richard Schickel, interviewing him based off of every single movie he's done, starting from his like early childhood and then just like going through his entire movie career. So it basically gets a real perspective on his mindset and creative process behind every film that he's ever made. So anybody who's interested in filmmaking at all should definitely pick this up. It's different than just like an autobiography because it's actually him speaking, and it's not edited down into a biography format, right? It's just an interview, but it's a very extensive interview. I think it's how many pages? It's like around 375 pages long, so it's a very extensive interview, and it covers all of his films, all of his entire creative process behind those films, which I find is very interesting. So, you can go into some of the films specifically. My favorite of his is Raging Bull, and I think that film is definitely very both personal to him, and it's a personal film for me, even though I don't relate to the character at all. It's the relation of the concept of the internal struggle that he's having, which I definitely related with a lot, more so than something like Taxi Driver. People consider Taxi Driver or Goodfellas to be his sort of best films. And the thing with Taxi Driver, I think that's also a great film, but the thing with Raging Bull, it's way more in depth and autobiographical, whatever. So, it's definitely, it has more of a personal connection, I would find, than Taxi Driver or Goodfellas, even though those films are definitely personal to him as a person. A Raging Bull is definitely, I mean, when you read the interview, you see what he was going through. He was like, essentially hitting a sense of rock bottom. He had a bad coke addiction at the time that he was coming off of. He didn't know how long he was going to live. And, he was just in very poor shape health-wise. And then, he discovered this film, or discovered this story about a boxer that Robert De Niro told him about. And he had no interest in doing a boxing movie because he had no relation to the sport. He was never an physically active child. He was never into sports or anything like that. But he found a way to sort of evoke his sense of struggle, internal struggle, in a concept that was completely foreign to him. And it turned out to be one of his best movies, if not his best movie, that in his career, which I find very interesting, that he managed to sort of create a narrative that was the most personal to him in a concept that was completely unrelated to him, right? It was, he's done the gangster movies, he's done Taxi Driver, the loner, isolated person in New York. He's done, religious movies, things that were connected to him from his childhood. And then he does a boxing movie, something that he never really involved himself in. He was never a part of any boxing league, or was never watched boxing ever. He never related to it on any level whatsoever, and yet he managed to make a film about boxing, which is not really about boxing, but it's about a person who is boxing, and it's probably his most personal film. I've repeated that, but I find that interesting that in the creative process, you don't necessarily need to go to the physical roots of what you're talking about. You don't need to go through and pick a topic or an environment that is essentially physically what you're related to. It's all about the experience, right? It's that human, whatever, the human experience you want to call it, that is the truest form of being able to relate to it. It doesn't matter what sort of physical illusion that surrounds it, right? And that's the case of boxing. It's not about boxing. He's a boxer. His outlet is boxing, but at the same time, Martin Scorsese is able to sort of involve himself and relate to this experience, not because it's boxing, but because it's a struggle of trying to be comfortable with yourself, I guess, or just being comfortable with the concept of being stationary as a man. And I think he had that problem at that time as well. And I don't think, he says that he had that problem as well with his coke addiction. And those two sort of were very similar in theme. So it's just one of the concepts that I found most interesting when reading this book. And, he goes into his other films. And, I feel like as a lot of artists get older, their art doesn't really stand the test of time as much as their earlier stuff, or the stuff that's sort of in the middle, right? So, I love Scorsese, but I think like it's obvious that his film career peaked after Goodfellas or Casino, whichever way you want to look at it. And, The Departed was a great film, but it just can't compare to his earlier stuff because it's different once you get to that age as an artist, I feel like. You become a lot more solidified, and there's nothing really you can do to prevent that. It's just part of life, and it doesn't mean that the art is going to be bad in any way. It's just in terms of the caliber and the raw energy that comes from it is going to be much more effective when you're in a state maybe like in your 30s and 40s. So anyway, that's all I have to really say about this. It's a really good book. I definitely would recommend checking it out if you're interested in it. And that's all I have to say about that. Have a wonderful day.